All right, let's just dive right into this. We're starting with a simple but really powerful story from Jesus' final day of public teaching in Jerusalem. And what might seem like just a small observation about giving money is actually the key that unlocks one of his most complex and, honestly, most controversial prophecies.
So right off the bat, Jesus paints this incredibly stark contrast. On one side, you've got the scribes. They love the status, right? The fancy robes, the VIP seats, everyone knowing their name. But Jesus sees right through it. He says they devour widows' houses. They're using their religious power to exploit the most vulnerable people. And then on the other side, you have this poor widow. She has absolutely none of that power, status, or wealth.
And Jesus does not mince words here. His judgment on these religious leaders is just severe. He's saying their hypocrisy, this obsession with looking good on the outside while being corrupt on the inside, has earned them a greater condemnation. It's an incredibly direct and serious warning. And this is what the widow gives. Two tiny little copper coins. We're talking about the smallest possible denomination of currency back then, worth less than a penny. In a noisy temple treasury, where rich people were making a big show of their donations, a loud clang of silver and gold, her gift would have been almost silent, completely invisible to everyone, except for Jesus.
Okay, so this is the absolute crucial point. The rich guys, they were giving from their surplus, their extra. It was a kind of giving that didn't really cost them anything, and it probably got them a lot of public praise. But her, she gave from her poverty. This wasn't her extra cash. This was everything. It was a radical act of complete trust and total devotion to God. And this one idea, this one act, becomes the lens for everything that comes next.
So hold on to that image of the widow, because now we're going to see how this story builds into something way, way bigger. As Jesus leaves the temple, the camera, so to speak, zooms out from the corrupt people in the system to a coming judgment on the entire system, which is all symbolized by this one magnificent building.
You really have to try and picture this scene. The disciples are basically tourists, just gawking at this architectural wonder. It's the center of their entire world, their national and religious identity. And some of these stones were the size of a bus, weighing 600 tons. They're looking at this and seeing permanence. They're seeing glory. They're seeing the very presence of God on earth. And then Jesus just drops a bombshell. The shock must have been just unbelievable. Where they see this indestructible symbol of strength, he sees a pile of rubble. He uses the language of complete deconstruction, not one stone left on another. This isn't just a prediction of what might happen. It's a declaration of a judgment that's already been decided.
So naturally, this is the question that lights the fuse for the whole prophecy. Hearing that, a few of the disciples pull him aside privately, and in their minds, the destruction of the temple could only mean one thing: the end of the world, the whole shebang. They've merged two completely separate ideas into one massive event, and they just want to know, when? What's the sign?
Jesus' answer is just a masterclass in untangling their confusion. And he starts by giving them a long list of things that are not the signs they should be looking for.
He runs through this list of frankly terrifying things: fake messiahs, wars, earthquakes, famines, exactly the kind of stuff that would make anyone think the end is near. But Jesus gives them a totally different way to think about it. He calls these the beginning of birth pains. So yeah, they are signs that a new age is on its way, but they are not the final event itself.
And right here is the crucial clarification. He tells them, don't be alarmed, don't be deceived by all the chaos. The world is going to see these kinds of tragedies, for sure. But this general state of suffering is not the specific immediate sign of the end. He's carving out a space of time between his life on earth and his ultimate return.
Okay, so now we get to the real heart of it. Jesus carefully takes the one big event the disciples were imagining and separates it into two very distinct events. This table just lays it out so perfectly. You've got event one, the destruction of Jerusalem. This is a local historical event that's going to happen within their generation. It's for a specific audience, people in Judea, and it has a very specific sign to look for. Then you have event two, the final coming. Its timing, totally unknown. It affects everyone, everywhere, and its signs, we're talking cosmic, unmistakable stuff. The instructions for each event are totally different too.
For that first event, the fall of Jerusalem, Jesus gives them one clear, actionable sign: the abomination of desolation. This is a phrase from the book of Daniel, and it basically means a pagan power is going to come in and desecrate the temple. And history tells us this is exactly what the Roman armies did in 70 AD. And for those who see this, the instruction is urgent and simple. Run. Don't pack. Don't hesitate. Just flee.
So that brings us back to the second part of their big question. If wars and famines and even the destruction of the temple aren't the ultimate sign, well, what is? Well, Jesus' answer here is on a completely different scale. I mean, we're talking about cosmic, universal signs. The very fabric of creation seems to unravel. The sun goes dark, the moon stops shining, stars are falling from the sky. This is not some regional conflict. This is an unmistakable global event. And this is the ultimate conclusion, right? You're not going to need an expert to interpret charts or decode secret messages. The sign of the end is the end itself. When the Son of Man returns, as Jesus says, coming in clouds with great power and glory, it's going to be obvious to every single person on earth. There will be absolutely no mistaking it.
And all of this leads us to the ultimate point of this entire prophecy. And it has nothing to do with predicting dates and everything to do with developing a certain way of being right now.
I mean, Jesus could not possibly be any clearer. The urge to create some kind of doomsday calendar is just wrong. He states flat out that the exact timing is known only by God the Father, not the angels and not even Him, the Son. That's a pretty powerful reason to stop trying to predict the unpredictable.
So if we're not supposed to be watching for dates, what are we supposed to be doing? The whole reason he's telling them all this isn't to satisfy our curiosity about the future, it's to shape how we live in the present. It's a command for his followers in every single generation.
This is the final command, and he repeats it. Stay awake. Be on your guard. Keep awake. It's this central theme of the whole chapter. It's a call to vigilance, to be prepared, to live a life of active, expectant faith.
And this is where the whole explainer comes full circle, so beautifully. The prophecy doesn't just end in the cosmos with falling stars. It brings us right back to that quiet, profound moment in the temple treasury. To stay awake isn't about anxiously scanning the news headlines. It's about living with the same kind of radical, all-in faith as that poor widow who held nothing back and trusted God with literally everything she had.
So in the end, the prophecy pivots from a question of when will this happen to a much more personal, much more urgent question: how should I live? It moves from some distant cosmic timeline right into the present moment. If readiness is the goal, what does it look like for you to be faithfully awake, not tomorrow, but right now, today?